"That woman doesn't belong in that seat." The words were meant to be whispered, but in a ballroom built for power and prestige, whispers traveled farther than people realized. Claire Bennett heard them the moment she stepped into the Grand Crescent Hotel. She simply pretended she hadn't. The crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet above the polished marble floor scattered warm golden light across the room like liquid sunlight. The annual Hale Foundation charity auction was one of the most exclusive events in Boston. Politicians attended. CEOs attended. Athletes, investors, philanthropists, and old money families attended. Tonight, a single dinner plate cost more than some Americans paid for rent in a month. Claire paused near the entrance, smoothing the sleeve of her navy blue dress. It wasn't designer. It wasn't custom-made. It was simply elegant. The kind of dress a woman bought because she liked it, not because she needed strangers to admire it. Around her, conversations floated through the air alongside the soft notes of a string quartet. Men in tailored tuxedos exchanged business cards worth millions. Women in sparkling gowns carried themselves with the practiced confidence of people accustomed to being noticed. Claire remained invisible. She preferred it that way. She moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a small envelope tucked inside her purse. Her invitation had arrived only 3 days earlier. At first, she thought it had been sent by mistake. People like her didn't usually attend events like this. She taught community health classes at local shelters. She volunteered at free clinics on weekends. Most of her days were spent helping people whose names would never appear in financial magazines. Yet somehow, her name had been included on the guest list. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for Victor Hale, billionaire entrepreneur, founder of Hale Global Industries, one of the most respected business leaders in America. The auction tonight would raise millions for medical research. Victor's presence alone guaranteed headlines. Claire found her assigned table near the front of the room. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she approached. Then she stopped. A small silver card displayed her name. Table 1. Seat 3. She blinked. There had to be some mistake. Table 1 was reserved for the evening's most distinguished guests. Governors, major donors, corporate leaders. Not women who drove 12-year-old sedans and spent their afternoons organizing free wellness workshops. Before she could double-check the card, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Claire turned. The man standing beside her looked to be in his early 40s. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair touched with just enough gray to appear distinguished rather than old. His tuxedo fit perfectly. So did his confidence. "I think you may have the wrong table," he said politely. Claire glanced at the card again. "I don't think so." The man smiled. It was the kind of smile people used when they were trying not to embarrass someone. "These front tables are usually reserved for major sponsors." "I understand. Maybe guest services can help you find your seat." Claire looked up at him. His expression wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was sympathetic, as though he genuinely believed she needed assistance. "My name is Ethan Brooks," he said. "I'm on the foundation board. If you'd like, I can walk you over." Claire almost laughed. Instead, she simply handed him the invitation. Ethan studied it, his brow furrowed. Then he looked at the silver place card, then back at the invitation. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "Claire Bennett. That's me. Interesting." He cleared his throat. "Well, there must be a reason." Claire smiled softly. "I assume so." Ethan returned the invitation. Something about her calmness unsettled him. Most people would have rushed to explain themselves. Most people would have justified their presence. Claire did neither. She simply sat down. Around them, several nearby guests exchanged curious glances. Claire noticed, but ignored them. She had spent most of her life being underestimated. It no longer surprised her. The auction hadn't even begun, and already she could feel people constructing stories about her. Maybe they assumed she was somebody's assistant. Maybe they thought she was a distant relative of a donor. Maybe they believed she had won some charity raffle. The truth didn't matter. Not yet. A waiter arrived with sparkling water. Claire thanked him. Ethan sat across from her, still occasionally glancing in her direction. He wasn't trying to be rude. He simply couldn't figure her out. She didn't belong to any category he recognized. No luxury handbag. No public reputation. No visible signs of influence. And yet she occupied one of the most important seats in the ballroom. The contradiction bothered him. The room suddenly shifted. It happened the way weather changes before a storm. Conversations softened. Heads turned toward the entrance. The string quartet stopped playing. Every eye in the ballroom moved in the same direction. Victor Hale had arrived. The billionaire entered surrounded by executives, security personnel, and event organizers. Cameras flashed immediately. The atmosphere changed with his presence. Confidence radiated from him without effort. At 62, Victor carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Ethan stood respectfully. So did everyone else. Claire remained seated for a moment before slowly rising with the crowd. Victor exchanged greetings near the entrance. Donors moved toward him. Reporters called his name. Foundation members approached with eager smiles. Then something unexpected happened. Victor stopped walking. His eyes narrowed. He was looking past everyone. Past the cameras. Past the executives. Past the politicians. His gaze locked onto someone across the ballroom. Claire felt a strange sensation in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. The billionaire's expression changed instantly. The practiced smile disappeared. For a brief moment, genuine emotion crossed his face. Then, without warning, Victor Hale turned away from every powerful person waiting to greet him and began walking directly toward table 1. Toward Claire Bennett. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The entire ballroom seemed suspended in a fragile silence as Victor Hale crossed the polished marble floor. Conversations faded into murmurs. The photographers lowered their cameras. Even the waitstaff appeared frozen in place. Claire watched him approach with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. But inside, memories she had carefully stored away for years began to stir. Ethan stood beside the table, uncertain whether he should remain standing or step aside. Victor ignored everyone around him. He passed a former governor. He passed a technology executive whose company had recently made national headlines. He passed donors who had contributed millions to the foundation. None of them received so much as a glance. His attention remained fixed on Claire. When he finally reached the table, his eyes softened. The room expected a business greeting, a polite handshake, perhaps an introduction. Instead, Victor smiled in a way few people had ever seen. It was not the smile of a billionaire addressing a guest. It was the smile of a man seeing someone he had searched for far longer than anyone realized. Claire Bennett, he said quietly. Hearing her name spoken by the most influential person in the room sent another ripple through the crowd. Claire rose from her chair. Good evening, Victor. Several nearby guests exchanged confused looks. They knew each other. Not only knew each other, they spoke like old acquaintances. Ethan felt a strange knot tighten in his chest. Victor let out a breath that almost sounded like relief. I cannot believe it is really you. Claire offered a small smile. It has been a long time. Far too long. Victor looked at her, as if confirming she was real. I have spent years hoping I would find you again. The silence around them deepened. Claire glanced toward the ballroom windows where the lights of Boston shimmered against the dark harbor beyond. I never expected any of this. Neither did I, Victor replied. But I never stopped looking. Ethan noticed something unusual then. Victor Hale, a man known for commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, appeared genuinely emotional. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a faint tremor in his voice. Yet it was unmistakable. Claire seemed unaffected by the attention gathering around them. She had the quiet composure of someone who did not measure her worth by the opinions of strangers. Victor gestured toward the empty chair beside her. May I? Of course. The billionaire sat down instead of returning to the head table prepared for him. A wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. Event organizers exchanged concerned glances. The evening schedule was beginning to unravel. Victor did not appear to care. You disappeared, he said. Claire laughed softly. I did not disappear. I simply lived my life. You changed your address 3 times. That was not intentional. You stopped using social media. I never enjoyed it. Victor shook his head with a smile. Do you know how difficult you were to find? Apparently very. Nearby guests leaned closer without realizing it. Ethan remained standing, unable to leave. Every answer only deepened the mystery. Victor reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn with age. He looked down at it for a moment before placing it on the table. Claire immediately recognized it. Her expression changed ever so slightly. You still have that? She asked. I carry it everywhere. Ethan glanced at the paper but could not read the writing from where he stood. Victor rested his hand over it. There are things money can buy, he said quietly. And there are things it never can. Claire lowered her gaze. You do not owe me anything. Victor looked at her with unmistakable conviction. That is where you are wrong. Before she could answer, the evening master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. The microphone crackled softly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Applause followed. The auction was about to begin. Guests slowly returned their attention toward the stage, though many continued stealing curious glances toward table 1. Victor remained seated beside Claire. The master of ceremonies welcomed sponsors, recognized donors, and outlined the foundation's fundraising goals. Yet Victor seemed distracted. Several times his eyes drifted toward the folded document resting beneath his hand. Ethan noticed it too. Whatever was written on that page mattered more to Victor than the event itself. As the first auction item appeared on stage, a handwritten note was delivered to Victor by an assistant. He read it briefly and smiled. Then he stood. Excuse me, he told Claire. There is something I need to do tonight. Claire looked up. Victor. Yes. You do not have to. His expression grew thoughtful. I know. He glanced around the ballroom filled with wealth, influence, and reputation. Then he looked back at her. That is exactly why I am going to. With the folded paper still in his hand, Victor Hale turned and began walking toward the stage, while hundreds of curious eyes followed him and wondered why the most powerful man in the room seemed determined to tell a story that began with a woman nobody had noticed until tonight. The ballroom lights seemed brighter as Victor Hale stepped onto the stage. The master of ceremonies immediately moved aside without protest. No one questioned the decision. When a man like Victor Hale wanted to speak, people listened. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward him. Crystal glasses rested on linen-covered tables. Conversations dissolved into silence. Victor stood beneath the glow of the chandeliers with the folded paper still in his hand. For several moments, he said nothing. His gaze traveled across the room until it settled on Claire. Then he smiled. Not the polished smile investors recognized from magazine covers. This one was different. Personal. Grateful. Before we continue with tonight's auction, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom, there is someone here I would like to acknowledge. Several guests exchanged curious glances. Ethan Brooks remained frozen beside table 1. Something told him the evening was about to become far more important than a fundraising event. Victor carefully unfolded the worn document. The paper looked old, delicate around the edges, protected by years of careful handling. Many of you know my story, he continued. You know about the companies, the acquisitions, the foundations, the success. A few polite smiles appeared throughout the crowd. Victor shook his head. What most people do not know is that 15 years ago, none of it was guaranteed. The room grew quieter. 15 years ago, I was driving through western Massachusetts during one of the worst winter storms of the season. My business was struggling. My personal life was falling apart. I was exhausted, lost, and completely alone. Claire lowered her eyes. She already knew where this story was going. Victor looked down at the paper in his hand. That night, I ended up stranded on a remote highway. His voice softened. There were not many cars on the road. Visibility was poor. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing. Most people would have kept driving. Several guests leaned forward in their seats. Victor continued. But one person stopped. His eyes returned to Claire, a young woman barely in her 20s. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Victor took a slow breath. She had every reason to keep going. She had her own responsibilities, her own life. Yet she stayed. The billionaire paused. The silence in the room became almost tangible. She made sure help arrived. She stayed until she knew I would be all right. She refused every attempt to reward her. She refused recognition. She refused publicity. A few guests glanced toward Claire. The realization was beginning to spread. Victor lifted the document slightly. This is the emergency report from that night. A murmur moved through the ballroom. I kept it because it contained the name of the person who changed the course of my life. Claire closed her eyes briefly. The memory returned with surprising clarity. A snow-covered highway. Flashing lights in the distance. A frightened young man trying desperately to hold himself together while pretending everything was fine. She had never considered the moment extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. Victor smiled gently. For years, I tried to find her. Every success I experienced reminded me that I had never properly thanked the person responsible for giving me another chance. The audience was completely captivated now. Nobody touched their food. Nobody checked their phones. Ethan felt a growing sense of embarrassment. He remembered how he had approached Claire earlier, how quickly he had assumed. She needed guidance, assistance, saving. Victor folded the paper carefully and placed it against his chest. Many people believe success comes from intelligence, determination, or opportunity. He glanced toward Claire again. Sometimes success begins with kindness. The words settled over the room. Quiet, powerful, unforgettable. Victor stepped away from the podium. Instead of remaining on stage, he walked back across the ballroom toward table 1. Cameras followed him. Every eye followed him. When he reached Claire, he stopped. The billionaire who could command global markets stood before a woman in a simple navy blue dress. Then he spoke words nobody in the room expected. "Thank you, Claire." Emotion flickered across his face. "You saved my life." The silence that followed felt sacred. Claire looked up at him. Her smile was small, humble, almost shy. "I only did what anyone should do." Victor laughed softly. No, his voice carried just enough for nearby guests to hear. "You did what very few people actually would have done." Around them, the ballroom remained perfectly still. Ethan stared at Claire as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a guest who seemed out of place. Not as a woman who needed help finding her seat. But as someone whose quiet choices had shaped lives far beyond her own. And as Victor Hale took the empty chair beside her once again, the mystery surrounding Claire Bennett only deepened, because everyone in that room suddenly realized there was far more to her story than a single winter night 15 years ago. The applause began slowly. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks as hundreds of people looked in her direction. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding attention, and now there was nowhere to hide from it. The sound echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers, filling every corner of the Grand Crescent Hotel. Yet what unsettled her most was not the applause. It was the way people were looking at her now. An hour earlier, many of them had barely noticed she existed. Now they stared as if she had suddenly become someone important. Claire lowered her gaze to the linen tablecloth. She had never changed. The room had. Victor remained seated beside her while the applause gradually faded. The auction resumed, but the atmosphere was different. Every conversation now included her name. Guests whispered, speculated, wondered. Some searched online. Others questioned foundation staff. Yet no one seemed able to find much information. Claire Bennett was not a celebrity. She was not an executive. She was not the owner of a successful company. The mystery only made people more curious. Across the table, Ethan Brooks watched her quietly. The assumptions he had made earlier now replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. He had looked at her dress and decided she was ordinary. He had looked at her calm demeanor and mistaken it for uncertainty. Most embarrassing of all, he had assumed she needed help. The realization stung. For years, Ethan had considered himself a good judge of character. Tonight was proving otherwise. "You seem remarkably comfortable," he finally said. Claire glanced up from her glass of sparkling water. Comfortable with what? Being the center of attention. A faint smile touched her lips. "I am not comfortable at all." Ethan laughed softly. "You hide it well." Claire considered that. People who spend their lives helping others learn how to stay calm during uncomfortable situations. Ethan nodded slowly. The answer intrigued him. "Victor mentioned you work in community health." "I do." "That seems like a very different world from this one." Claire looked around the ballroom. The diamonds, the luxury watches, the polished image of success. "It is." "Do you ever wish you had chosen a different path?" Her answer came immediately. "Never." The certainty surprised him. There was no hesitation, no regret, no longing. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had already found what mattered. Before Ethan could respond, another guest approached their table. Then another. Soon a small line had formed. People who would never have noticed Claire before suddenly wanted introductions. They praised her, complimented her, asked questions. Claire answered politely but briefly. She thanked them and redirected every conversation away from herself whenever possible. Victor observed the scene with amusement. "You realize they are fascinated by you now," he said after the crowd finally dispersed. Claire sighed. "That will fade." "Probably." "Good." Victor laughed. "You really have not changed." For a moment, neither spoke. The auctioneer's voice echoed from the stage as bidding climbed into six figures for a vacation package. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light. Beyond the ballroom windows, Boston Harbor shimmered beneath the night sky. Victor studied Claire carefully. "Do you know what I remember most about that night?" She looked surprised. "After 15 years? Some memories do not fade." Claire folded her hands in her lap. "What do you remember?" Victor smiled. "You kept asking questions." "Questions? About my family, my goals, my plans." His expression softened. "At the time, I thought you were simply making conversation." Claire laughed quietly. "I was trying to keep your mind occupied." "I know that now." Victor glanced toward the harbor lights. "But there was something else." "What?" "You never once asked who I was." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Should I have?" "Most people would have." Victor looked around the ballroom, filled with influential guests. Even back then, people cared about titles, money, status. His gaze returned to her. "You cared whether I was all right." The words settled between them. Simple, honest, true. Ethan listened from across the table and felt something shift inside him. The room had spent the evening celebrating achievement, wealth, recognition. Yet the quality Victor seemed to value most was kindness. Not because it was rare among struggling people, because it was rare among successful ones. As another round of applause rose from the auction stage, Victor glanced toward the folded emergency report resting beside his plate. Then he looked back at Claire. "There is still one thing I never understood." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Victor smiled thoughtfully. "After everything you did for me that night, why did you walk away without even telling me your dream?" Claire looked out, toward the dark harbor beyond the glass. For the first time all evening, something reflective appeared in her eyes. A memory, a story, a chapter of her life nobody in that ballroom knew yet. And when she finally answered, her voice was almost a whisper. "Because back then, I had already given up on it." For a moment, the sounds of the auction seemed to drift into the background. The clinking glasses, the auctioneer's voice, the polite laughter floating through the ballroom all faded beneath the weight of Claire's words. Victor studied her carefully. "You gave up on it?" he asked. Claire nodded. A faint smile appeared on her face, though it carried more nostalgia than happiness. "It sounds dramatic now, but at 22 it felt perfectly reasonable." Ethan remained silent across the table, listening. So were several nearby guests who had gradually become captivated by the conversation unfolding around Claire. "What was the dream?" Victor asked. Claire glanced toward the harbor lights beyond the tall windows. "I wanted to open community wellness centers." Victor looked surprised. "That was your dream? A small one?" "No," he shook his head. "Not small." Claire laughed softly. "Most people thought it was." She folded her hands together. "I grew up watching families struggle to find basic healthcare resources. Not because they did not care, because they did not know where to go. I wanted to create places where people could find guidance without feeling judged." Victor listened without interrupting. "I imagined centers with nurses, counselors, nutrition programs, support groups, education classes. Places where ordinary people could walk in and ask questions without worrying about money." Ethan frowned slightly. "That sounds ambitious." "Exactly," Claire smiled. "Which is why I eventually stopped talking about it." The words lingered in the air. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Who told you it was impossible?" Claire hesitated. "Nobody directly." "That means somebody did." She looked down at the tablecloth. "Life did." Her voice remained calm, but the memory behind it was clear. "My father got sick during my final year of college. Medical bills piled up. My mother needed help. My younger brother was still in school. Suddenly, there were more urgent things to worry about than dreams." Victor nodded slowly. He understood that kind of responsibility. Claire continued. "After graduation, I took the first stable job I could find. Then another. Then another. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. And the dream?" Ethan asked quietly. Claire smiled again. "It stayed where most forgotten dreams go." Around them, the ballroom continued celebrating generosity and wealth. Yet none of it felt as compelling as the simple honesty in Claire's voice. Victor rested his elbows lightly on the table. "You know something interesting?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "What?" "The entire reason the Hale Foundation exists is because of that night." She looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" Victor's eyes reflected the chandelier light above them. "When you found me 15 years ago, I was obsessed with growth, revenue, expansion. Every goal revolved around making the company bigger. His smile faded slightly. You asked me a question. Claire searched her memory. One question changed everything. Apparently. Ethan leaned forward. What was it? Victor laughed softly. You asked me what I planned to do once I finally had enough. Claire blinked. That does sound like something I would ask. At the time, I did not have an answer. Victor glanced around the ballroom. For years afterward, the question followed me. Claire remained silent. Eventually, I realized there is no such thing as enough. Victor's voice carried a quiet conviction. The finish line keeps moving. He gestured toward the auction stage where another item had just sold for a substantial amount. The only meaningful thing is what you do with what you have. Ethan sat back slowly. The conversation felt less like small talk and more like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Victor looked directly at Claire. You may think you abandoned your dream. I did. No, he shook his head firmly. You simply built it differently. Claire frowned slightly. I'm not sure what that means. Victor smiled. How many people attended your community health workshops last year? She looked surprised by the question. Approximately 4,000. Ethan's eyes widened. Victor continued. How many shelters partner with your programs? 23. How many volunteer professionals work with you? Claire hesitated. Just over 100. Victor spread his hands. That sounds remarkably similar to the dream you described. For the first time all evening, Claire seemed genuinely speechless. She stared at him for several seconds. Then she laughed quietly and shook her head. I never thought about it that way. Most people do not. Victor's expression softened. They become so focused on what they have not accomplished that they fail to see what they already have. The words settled deeply within her. Across the ballroom, the auction neared its final segment. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about something. Earlier that evening, he had assumed Claire was a woman who needed help finding the correct table. Now he was beginning to suspect that nearly everyone in the room had misunderstood her in exactly the same way. They had measured success through visibility, through status, through recognition. Claire had been building something meaningful for years without seeking any of those things. And as Victor quietly reached for the folded emergency report once more, a thought crossed his mind. If the story everyone had heard tonight was only the beginning, then perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of Claire Bennett's life had not happened 15 years ago at all. Perhaps it was happening right now. The final auction item of the evening was displayed on stage, yet Claire barely noticed. Her thoughts lingered on Victor's words. For years she had measured her life against a version of success she never achieved. The wellness centers she once imagined had never materialized. The carefully drafted business plans had remained tucked away in old storage boxes. The fundraising proposals had never moved beyond the earliest stages. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that the dream belonged to a younger version of her. A version with more time, more energy, and fewer responsibilities. Yet sitting beneath the glow of the chandeliers, surrounded by people who spent their lives pursuing recognition, she found herself wondering if Victor was right. Perhaps the dream had not disappeared. Perhaps it had simply changed shape. You are thinking too hard again. Victor's voice pulled her back to the present. Claire smiled. I have been accused of that before. Frequently. More than once. Victor laughed quietly. Around them, guests continued stealing glances toward their table. Some smiled politely. Others looked openly fascinated. A few appeared almost disappointed to discover that Claire was neither a celebrity nor a secret heiress. She was simply a woman whose life did not fit neatly into the categories they understood. Ethan noticed the same thing. Earlier, he would have considered the attention flattering. Now it felt strangely revealing. People were not interested in Claire because of who she was. They were interested because Victor Hale had validated her importance. The realization left him uncomfortable. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Claire looked toward him. Of course. He hesitated. Have you ever regretted helping people? The question surprised both Claire and Victor. Ethan immediately shook his head. That came out wrong. Claire smiled. I know what you meant. She considered the question carefully. There were moments when I felt tired. Moments when I wondered if anything I was doing mattered. Her eyes drifted toward the ballroom windows. But regret? No. Ethan nodded slowly. Even when nobody noticed? Especially then. The answer settled over the table. Victor looked pleased. Ethan looked thoughtful. Claire simply sounded honest. The auctioneer announced another successful bid, drawing applause from the crowd. Millions of dollars had been pledged throughout the evening. It was an extraordinary amount of money. Yet Victor found himself thinking about something else entirely. He reached into his jacket and removed a small leather notebook. The cover was worn from years of use. Claire noticed immediately. "You still carry that?" Victor smiled. "Every day." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Victor opened the notebook carefully. Between pages filled with notes, ideas, and reminders was a folded piece of paper yellowed by time. Claire recognized it at once. "You kept that too?" she asked. Victor nodded. "I told you. Some things matter." Ethan watched as Victor unfolded the paper. It was not a business document. It was not a contract. It was a simple sheet covered in handwriting. Claire stared at it in disbelief. "That cannot be." "It is." Victor handed it to her. Slowly, she began reading. 15 years earlier, while waiting for assistance to arrive during that winter storm, she had filled a scrap piece of paper with ideas. Not because she expected anyone to read them, simply because she always carried notes with her. Ideas for community education programs, mobile wellness services, local support networks. Dreams sketched in hurried handwriting by a 22-year-old woman who still believed she might change the world. Claire looked up. "You saved this?" "I did." "Why?" Victor smiled. "Because I wanted to remember the person who gave me perspective." His voice softened. "That paper reminded me there were people building lives around purpose instead of profit." Claire stared at the faded handwriting. She had completely forgotten it existed. Yet there it was. A snapshot of a younger self she thought had disappeared long ago. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she laughed quietly. Not because it was funny, because it felt impossible. Across the ballroom, the final auction concluded to thunderous applause. Guests rose from their seats. The event had officially been a tremendous success. But for Claire, something unexpected had happened tonight. She arrived believing she had been invited by mistake. She arrived expecting to remain unnoticed. Instead, she found pieces of herself she had forgotten. And as she looked down at the worn page resting in her hands, she realized the story Victor had shared with the room was only half true. Yes, she had once helped change the direction of his life. But tonight, without even realizing it, he had returned the favor. The ballroom gradually began to empty, but the energy of the evening lingered like the final notes of a song that nobody wanted to end. Guests gathered near the exits, exchanging observations about the auction, the donations, and most of all, Claire Bennett. Her name traveled through conversations that stretched from one end of the room to the other. Yet Claire remained seated at table 1, staring at the worn piece of paper in her hands. The faded handwriting belonged to a version of herself she barely remembered. A young woman full of certainty, full of hope. A woman who believed good ideas alone could change lives. She traced one line with her fingertip. Mobile health education units for underserved communities. Another line followed. Free wellness counseling for families facing financial hardship. Then another. Volunteer partnerships with local schools and churches. The ideas seemed simple now, almost obvious. Yet 15 years earlier, they had represented everything she wanted to build. "You are smiling," Victor observed. Claire looked up. "Am I?" "You are." She folded the paper carefully. "I was just remembering who I used to be." Victor shook his head. "No." Claire raised an eyebrow. "No. You are remembering who you still are." The words settled gently between them. Across the table, Ethan watched the exchange. Earlier that evening, he had viewed Victor Hale as the most impressive person in the room. Now he was beginning to understand why Victor himself seemed so fascinated by Claire. She possessed something rare. Not wealth, not influence. Something far more difficult to find. She had never built her identity around being admired. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan asked suddenly. Claire turned toward him. "Of course." He exhaled slowly. "When I first saw you tonight, I thought you looked out of place." Claire laughed softly. "You are not the first person." Ethan managed a sheepish smile. "I was wrong. You barely knew me." "That is exactly the problem." He glanced around the ballroom. "I thought I understood who people were by looking at them." Claire studied him for a moment. "Most people do." "Do you?" She considered the question carefully. "I try not to." Ethan nodded. "How?" Claire looked toward the remaining guests. "Because everyone is carrying a story you cannot see." Her voice remained calm. "A struggle, a sacrifice, a disappointment, a dream. Most of the important parts are invisible." Ethan found himself unable to disagree. The evening had become a lesson he never expected to receive. Victor stood and adjusted his jacket. Several Foundation executives were waiting nearby, hoping for a few moments of his attention before the event officially concluded. Yet he lingered. "There is something else," he said. Claire looked up. "What is it?" Victor smiled. "The Foundation board meets next month." Claire immediately looked suspicious. "Victor, hear me out." Ethan laughed because he already recognized the expression on Victor's face. It was the look of a man preparing to make an offer. "I know that look," Claire said. "Do you? You are about to ask me for something." Victor smiled wider. "Possibly." Claire shook her head. "That is dangerous. Only if you say yes." Ethan watched with amusement as the billionaire seemed genuinely pleased by her resistance. Most people spent their lives trying to gain access to powerful individuals. Claire appeared determined to keep them at a comfortable distance. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Victor leaned slightly closer. "I want you to speak to the board." Claire blinked. "Absolutely not." Ethan laughed out loud. Victor looked delighted. "You rejected that much faster than I expected. Because I know where this leads." "Where?" "Committees. Meetings. PowerPoint presentations." Victor placed a hand over his heart. "You wound me." Claire smiled despite herself. The ease between them surprised Ethan. For two people who had spent 15 years apart, they spoke with the comfort of old friends. Perhaps gratitude created its own kind of connection. Victor eventually glanced toward the executives waiting near the stage. Duty was calling. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Think about it." Claire sighed. "I already know I am going to regret whatever comes next." "Excellent." Victor's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. That is usually the first sign of a worthwhile opportunity. As he walked away, Claire shook her head and slipped the old piece of paper back into her purse. Yet despite her protests, something had changed. For years, she had viewed those forgotten dreams as relics of another life. Tonight, they no longer felt forgotten. They felt unfinished. And as she watched Victor disappear into a crowd of executives and donors, she found herself wondering whether the unexpected invitation that brought her here had never been about gratitude alone. Perhaps it was the beginning of something neither of them had planned. 3 weeks later, Claire found herself standing outside the Hale Foundation headquarters with a mixture of curiosity and regret. The building rose above downtown Boston in steel and glass, reflecting the pale morning sunlight across neighboring skyscrapers. She still was not entirely certain how Victor had persuaded her to attend the board meeting. In truth, he had not persuaded her at all. He had simply called twice, sent one email, and then quietly arranged for a packet of information to arrive at her office. Inside were reports, community surveys, and statistics from neighborhoods she knew well. By the time she finished reading them, she realized she was already thinking about solutions. That was how Victor won. Not through pressure, through purpose. Claire stepped through the revolving doors and entered a lobby large enough to fit her entire apartment. Polished stone floors reflected soft overhead lighting. Employees moved through the space carrying tablets and coffee cups. Everything felt efficient, organized, important. A receptionist greeted her immediately. "Ms. Bennett, they are expecting you." Claire almost laughed. The phrase still sounded strange. Expecting you. For most of her life, she had been the person arranging chairs, setting up programs, filling out paperwork, and staying behind after events ended. She was rarely the person people expected. An elevator carried her to the 26th floor. As the doors opened, she found herself facing a conference room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Boston Harbor shimmered in the distance beneath a bright blue sky. Around a long table sat executives, foundation directors, financial advisors, and nonprofit leaders. Men and women whose decisions influenced millions of dollars in funding each year. Several turned toward her as she entered. Claire immediately recognized a familiar face. Ethan Brooks stood near the windows holding a folder. "You came." She smiled. "Apparently I make poor decisions." Ethan laughed. "Victor said you would say something like that." Before Claire could respond, another voice interrupted. "You are late." Victor stood at the head of the table. His expression was serious for exactly 2 seconds before a grin appeared. "Which means you are perfectly on time." Claire shook her head. "I should have known." The meeting began moments later. At first, she listened quietly. Charts appeared on large screens. Budget projections were discussed. Regional healthcare disparities were analyzed. The conversation was intelligent, detailed, and impressively thorough. Yet something bothered her. After nearly 40 minutes, Claire finally raised her hand. The room fell silent. Yes, Victor asked. Claire glanced around the table. May I ask a question? Of course. She looked toward one of the presentation slides displaying funding allocations. How many people in these neighborhoods were actually asked what they need? Several board members exchanged glances. One executive answered carefully. We conducted extensive research. That is not what I asked. The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire's voice remained calm. How many residents were invited into the conversation? Nobody answered immediately. Claire nodded slightly. That is what I thought. Ethan tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile. For the next 20 minutes, Claire spoke about families she had met. Single parents balancing multiple jobs. Elderly residents struggling to navigate healthcare systems. Teenagers caring for younger siblings. Communities full of capable people who simply lacked access to reliable information and support. She spoke without notes, without presentation slides, without rehearsed language. She spoke from experience. Something remarkable happened. The room listened, not because Victor Hale sat beside her, not because of a dramatic story from 15 years ago. They listened because she understood problems the data alone could not explain. By the time she finished, even the most skeptical board members were taking notes. Victor remained silent throughout most of it. He simply watched, the same way he had watched her years ago during a snowstorm. With admiration, with curiosity, with the recognition that some people carry wisdom that cannot be measured on a balance sheet. When the meeting finally ended, several directors approached Claire with questions. Others requested follow-up conversations. One foundation advisor asked whether she would consider helping design future programs. Claire felt slightly overwhelmed. Ethan walked beside her toward the elevators. How are you feeling? He asked. Claire stared out at the harbor beyond the windows. Confused. Why? She smiled softly. Because for the first time in a very long time, I think I might be standing closer to my dream than I realized. And somewhere behind them, standing alone in the conference room, Victor Hale looked down at the old emergency report he still carried and smiled. Because 15 years earlier he believed one extraordinary act of kindness had changed his life. But now he was beginning to suspect that Claire Bennett's greatest impact on the world was only beginning. Over the following month, Claire's routine changed in ways she never expected. Her days still began early. She still visited community centers, organized workshops, answered emails from volunteers, and spent hours listening to people whose problems rarely appeared in reports or board presentations. Yet now, between those responsibilities, there were meetings with foundation staff, conference calls with program directors, and long conversations about how to turn ideas into reality. The adjustment felt strange. Not because the work was unfamiliar, because suddenly people with resources were listening. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Claire stood inside a neighborhood recreation center in Dorchester reviewing plans for a pilot wellness program. Folding tables filled the gymnasium. Volunteers moved boxes of educational materials across the floor. Children played basketball in the far corner, while parents gathered near a registration table. It was not glamorous. There were no crystal chandeliers, no luxury suits, no photographers. Yet this felt far more important to her than any gala. Ethan arrived carrying 2 coffees and a folder thick with documents. You know, he said, handing her a cup. Most people would have hired a consultant by now. Claire smiled. Most consultants do not know these families. Ethan looked around the building. You really love this work. I do, even when it is exhausting. Claire laughed softly. Especially then. Ethan shook his head in amazement. The more time he spent around her, the more he realized how unusual she was. Most people became energized by recognition. Claire became energized by usefulness. The distinction mattered. Across town, Victor sat in his office reviewing progress reports. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston stretched beneath a gray sky. The city moved with its usual urgency while he studied updates from programs Claire had helped redesign. The results were already encouraging. Participation rates were increasing. Community engagement was improving. More importantly, residents felt heard. Victor leaned back in his chair and smiled. Numbers mattered. Data mattered. But trust mattered more. His assistant knocked lightly before entering. You have 10 minutes before your next meeting. Victor nodded. Thank you. She hesitated. There is one more thing. What is it? The board unanimously approved the community initiative. Victor was not surprised. Good. The funding level is significantly higher than originally proposed. That caught his attention. How much higher? She told him. Victor stared at her for a moment before laughing quietly. Apparently, Claire has become very persuasive. Meanwhile, Claire remained completely unaware of the decision. She spent the afternoon helping volunteers assemble information packets and answering questions from local residents. By the time she finally checked her phone, she had 3 missed calls from Ethan and 2 from Victor. That cannot be good, she murmured. Moments later, Ethan called again. Where are you? At the recreation center. Good. Stay there. Claire frowned. Why? Because everyone is coming to you. Everyone. You will see. 30 minutes later, a small caravan of vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Foundation directors emerged first, then program coordinators, then local officials. Finally, Victor stepped out of a black sedan, wearing the same expression he had worn at the gala whenever he was trying not to reveal a surprise. Claire immediately became suspicious. What did you do? Victor placed a hand over his heart. Why does everyone assume it was me? Ethan laughed. Because it was definitely you. Volunteers gathered nearby, curious about the unexpected visitors. Families paused conversations to watch. Victor looked around the busy recreation center before turning back to Claire. A month ago, you asked how many people were actually invited into the conversation. Claire nodded cautiously. I remember. The board listened. He handed her a folder. Inside was a proposal unlike anything she had ever seen. Funding allocations, development schedules, staffing plans, community partnerships. Not for one center. For several. Claire stared at the pages, then looked up, then looked down again. This is not real. It is. Her eyes moved across the figures once more. The scale exceeded anything she had imagined possible. Victor, you earned this. Claire shook her head immediately. No, his expression softened. There you go again. What? Thinking this is about you. He gestured toward the families filling the recreation center. It never was. For a moment, Claire could not speak. Around her, children laughed. Volunteers organized supplies. Parents discussed upcoming workshops. Ordinary people continued living ordinary lives. Yet standing there with the proposal in her hands, Claire suddenly understood something. 15 years ago, she believed changing the world required extraordinary influence. Now she knew better. Sometimes it began with one conversation, one choice, one person deciding to stop and help when nobody expected them to. And as the people around her continued moving through their day, unaware of how much the future had just changed, Claire felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. 6 months later, the first center opened on a bright September morning beneath a cloudless New England sky. Claire stood near the entrance long before the ribbon-cutting ceremony began. The building itself was not extravagant. It was not covered in marble or glass. It sat on a busy neighborhood corner between a grocery store and a public library. Yet to Claire, it looked more beautiful than any luxury hotel ballroom she had ever seen. Large windows filled the space with sunlight. Classrooms waited for educational workshops. Counseling offices stood ready for families seeking guidance. Community rooms had already been reserved weeks in advance. Children played on the sidewalk while volunteers arranged welcome materials inside. The center felt alive before it officially opened its doors. Claire looked at the sign mounted above the entrance and felt a familiar mixture of pride and disbelief. For years, the dream had existed only in notebooks, conversations, and late-night ideas. Now it stood in front of her, real enough to touch. You are doing it again. Ethan's voice appeared beside her. Claire smiled. Doing what? Looking like you are not sure this is actually happening. She laughed softly. I'm still getting used to it. Ethan glanced toward the growing crowd. Local residents gathered near the entrance. Reporters adjusted camera equipment. Community leaders greeted one another. You know, he said, most people would be making speeches about their accomplishments today. Claire shook her head immediately. That sounds exhausting. Ethan smiled. You have not changed. Neither have you. I certainly hope I have. Claire looked at him curiously. Ethan folded his hands in front of him. 6 months ago, I thought success meant being the smartest person in the room. And now I think it might mean helping other people become successful. Claire considered that. That is a much better definition. Across the street, a black sedan pulled to the curb. Victor stepped out and immediately became the center of attention. Reporters moved toward him. Local officials approached with eager smiles. Yet just as he had done at the gala months earlier, he ignored the attention and walked directly toward Claire. "Good morning," he said. "You are late." Victor looked offended. "I am 3 minutes early." "That is late for you." Ethan laughed. Victor pointed at him. "I do not appreciate being outnumbered." The easy conversation settled Claire's nerves. Despite the cameras and guests, the morning felt strangely personal. Victor looked up at the building and nodded with satisfaction. "You realize this is only the beginning." Claire sighed. "There it is." "What?" "The look." "What look?" "The one that means you already have another idea." Victor smiled innocently. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "That confirms it." Before he could defend himself, a reporter approached. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Bennett, we are ready." The ceremony began minutes later. Speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Local officials discussed community investment. Foundation representatives highlighted partnerships and volunteers. Residents shared stories about the challenges they faced and the opportunities they hoped the center would create. Claire listened carefully. More than once, she felt her throat tighten with emotion. These were the voices she had always wanted people to hear. Finally, Victor stepped to the podium. The crowd applauded immediately. He thanked donors, volunteers, staff members, community leaders. Then his gaze moved toward Claire. "Many people have asked how this project began," he said. "They assume it started in a boardroom or during a strategic planning session." He smiled. It did not. The audience grew quiet. Victor looked toward the building behind him. Sometimes the most important things begin when one person chooses to care. Claire immediately knew where he was going and shook her head. Victor ignored her completely. Years ago, someone offered help without expecting recognition. She never asked for credit. She never asked for rewards. She simply believed people mattered. The crowd followed his gaze toward Claire. Cameras turned in her direction. Ethan smiled because he knew she hated this part. Victor continued. "Everything standing behind us today exists because that belief never disappeared." Applause spread through the crowd. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks once again. Yet this time something was different. Months earlier, she would have felt embarrassed. Now she simply felt grateful. Not for the attention, for the opportunity. As the ribbon was cut and the doors officially opened, families began entering the center for the first time. Children rushed toward activity rooms. Parents explored classrooms. Volunteers greeted visitors with smiles. Life immediately filled the building. Claire stood quietly near the entrance and watched. This was the moment she had imagined years ago without ever believing she would see it. And as sunlight poured through the windows and laughter echoed through the halls, she realized the dream had never truly belonged to her alone. It belonged to every person who walked through those doors searching for hope, guidance, and a chance to move forward. The months that followed transformed more than a single neighborhood. What began as one community center quickly became a model that attracted attention across Massachusetts. Local newspapers covered the results. Health organizations requested meetings. Community leaders from other cities toured the facility and asked how it had succeeded where so many programs had struggled. The answer was never complicated. Claire gave the same response every time. Listen first, build second. Yet the simplicity of that philosophy was precisely what made it powerful. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the gala that had unexpectedly changed the course of her life, Claire stood inside a conference hall overlooking Boston Harbor. The annual Community Impact Summit had drawn nonprofit leaders, educators, healthcare professionals, and public officials from across the region. Large banners displayed statistics highlighting successful initiatives. Tables filled the expansive room. Conversations buzzed beneath elegant lighting. Claire still felt slightly uncomfortable at events like this. She had become more accustomed to speaking publicly, but she never enjoyed being the focus of attention. Her favorite part of any project remained the work itself. The people, the conversations, the practical solutions. Recognition always felt secondary. "You are hiding again." Ethan appeared beside her carrying 2 cups of coffee. Claire accepted one with a grateful smile. "I am not hiding. You are standing behind a decorative plant." Claire glanced at the large potted tree beside her. "That is purely coincidental." Ethan laughed. "Of course it is." They watched attendees move through the conference hall. Several people approached to greet Claire throughout the afternoon. Some wanted advice. Others wanted partnerships. A few simply wanted to thank her. She handled every conversation with the same quiet kindness that had become her trademark. Ethan noticed something interesting. The more successful Claire became, the less interested she seemed in discussing herself. Most people moved in the opposite direction. Across the room, Victor was finishing a conversation with several state officials. Though still one of the most influential people present, he no longer attracted the same level of attention whenever he entered a room. Not because his reputation had diminished, because another story had captured people's imagination. They wanted to meet the woman whose ideas were reshaping communities. Victor eventually joined them. "I have been looking for you." Claire immediately narrowed her eyes. "That sentence never leads anywhere good." Victor looked offended. "I am deeply wounded by your lack of trust." Ethan laughed. "What are you planning?" "Nothing." "That is even more suspicious." Before Victor could respond, an announcement echoed through the hall. Guests were invited to take their seats for the evening presentation. Hundreds of attendees moved toward a large auditorium overlooking the harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the water beyond while soft golden light filled the room. Claire settled into a seat near the back, exactly where she preferred to be. Victor sat beside her. Ethan occupied the chair on her other side. "Why are both of you sitting here?" Claire asked. "Support." Victor answered immediately. "Surveillance," Ethan said at the same time. Claire laughed. The program began with reports highlighting successful community initiatives from around the state. Speakers discussed measurable improvements, increased participation rates, better educational outcomes, expanded access to services. Claire listened attentively, proud of what countless volunteers and professionals had accomplished together. Then the final presenter stepped onto the stage. The moderator smiled. "Before we conclude, there is one more recognition we would like to share." Claire paid little attention at first. Awards and recognitions were common at conferences like this. She assumed it involved another organization. Then a photograph appeared on the enormous screen behind the stage. Her photograph. Claire froze. "Victor." "Yes." "What did you do?" "Absolutely nothing." His expression suggested otherwise. The audience began applauding. Claire immediately considered leaving through the nearest exit. Ethan noticed. "Do not even think about it." "I am serious." "So am I." The moderator continued speaking. "Sometimes leadership does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, works tirelessly, and changes lives without seeking recognition." Claire covered her face with one hand. Victor looked entirely too pleased. "This year, we are recognizing someone whose vision has helped communities across the state rediscover what is possible." The applause grew louder. Yet as Claire looked around the auditorium, something unexpected happened. She recognized many faces. Families from the neighborhood center, volunteers, counselors, teachers, parents, people whose lives had become intertwined with the programs she helped create. They were not applauding because of status. They were applauding because they had experienced the impact firsthand. For the first time, the recognition felt different. It was not about being admired. It was about seeing the results reflected in real people. And as the audience rose to its feet, Claire realized that the dream she once abandoned had grown far beyond anything she imagined, because it was no longer simply her dream. It belonged to an entire community moving forward together. Claire remained standing as the applause filled the auditorium. The sound seemed to arrive from far away, as though she were hearing it through water. Hundreds of people were on their feet. Volunteers she had worked beside, families she had met during long afternoons at community centers, teachers, counselors, healthcare workers, parents, students, faces she recognized and faces she did not. Yet all of them were connected by a single thread. They had become part of something larger than any one person. For a moment, Claire simply stood there, unsure what to do. Recognition had never been her goal. It still was not. The moderator gently motioned toward the stage. Ethan nudged her shoulder. "You have to go." Claire sighed. "I was afraid you were going to say that." Victor smiled. "We believe in you." "That is the problem." Ethan laughed. "Go." Claire made her way toward the stage as the applause gradually softened. The bright lights overhead reflected against the harbor beyond the windows, turning the water into ribbons of gold and silver. She accepted the award with both hands and immediately wished there were a faster way to leave. The audience noticed. Their laughter carried warmth rather than judgment. The moderator stepped aside and handed her the microphone. Claire looked out across the room. Public speaking had become easier over the past year, but standing in front of hundreds of people still felt unnatural. She glanced toward Ethan and Victor. Both offered encouraging smiles. Claire took a slow breath. I am probably the wrong person to receive this. The audience laughed again. No, seriously. More laughter followed. Claire smiled. The truth is that nothing we have accomplished happened because of one person. She looked around the auditorium. Every successful program began with people who cared enough to show up. Volunteers, staff members, community leaders, families who trusted us, professionals who donated time they could have spent elsewhere. The room grew quieter. When people tell stories about change, they usually focus on a single individual. Her gaze drifted toward the harbor. But real change rarely works that way. It is usually hundreds of small acts of kindness connected together. Several audience members nodded. Claire continued. A volunteer helping a family complete paperwork. A teacher staying late to support a student. A nurse answering one more question before going home. A neighbor checking on someone who feels forgotten. Her voice remained calm and steady. Most important things happen without cameras. Silence settled across the room. Not empty silence. The kind that appears when people recognize truth. Claire glanced toward Victor. A year ago, I attended a gala because I thought someone had accidentally invited me. Laughter spread through the audience. Victor looked entirely unapologetic. I spent most of that evening trying to avoid attention. You failed. Ethan called from the audience, drawing more laughter. Claire smiled. Clearly. Then her expression softened. What happened afterward reminded me of something I had forgotten. She paused. Dreams do not always disappear. Sometimes they simply wait until we are ready. The words lingered in the air. Claire thought about the younger version of herself. The college student filling pages with ideas. The woman who eventually packed those ideas away because life demanded practical choices. She thought about the recreation centers, the workshops, the families whose stories had shaped every decision. She thought about the snowstorm 15 years earlier and how impossible it would have seemed to predict any of this. There were many years when I believed I had fallen short of what I hoped to accomplish, she admitted. I think a lot of people feel that way. Several faces in the audience reflected recognition. But sometimes we are so focused on the destination that we fail to see how far we have already traveled. The room remained perfectly still. Claire looked down briefly at the award in her hands, then back at the audience. If there is anything worth celebrating tonight, it is not me. Her voice softened. It is the reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary impact. The applause began before she finished speaking, not because the speech was dramatic, because it felt genuine. Claire stepped away from the microphone and returned to her seat. Ethan stood to hug her briefly. Victor shook his head with quiet admiration. You realize that was better than anything I could have said. Claire laughed. That is because your speeches are too long. Victor looked wounded. Ethan nearly spilled his coffee laughing. Yet as the applause continued around them and the evening moved toward its conclusion, Claire felt something she had not experienced in years. Not pride, not relief, peace. The kind that comes when a person finally understands that the value of a life is not measured by recognition received, but by the lives quietly touched along the way. The conference ended long after sunset. One by one, attendees filtered out into the cool evening air while the lights of Boston reflected across the harbor like scattered stars. Claire remained near the windows for a few extra minutes, watching the water move beneath the darkness. The award rested quietly beside her on a nearby table. She had almost forgotten it was there. Ethan joined her first. You know, he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. A year ago you would have been looking for the nearest exit by now. Claire smiled. That is still true. Then why are you still here? She looked out toward the harbor. Because I am trying to remember this. Ethan followed her gaze. The view, the feeling. He nodded slowly. He understood. Some moments arrived so unexpectedly that people spent years trying to recapture them afterward. Not because they were dramatic, because they revealed something important. A few moments later, Victor approached carrying his jacket over one arm. For once, there were no reporters surrounding him. No executives waiting for decisions. No assistants carrying schedules. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man enjoying the end of a very good day. There you are, he said. I was beginning to think you escaped. I considered it. Of course you did. They stood together near the glass overlooking the harbor. For a while, nobody spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned, the kind shared by people who no longer needed to impress one another. Finally, Victor broke it. Do you remember what you told me 15 years ago? Claire laughed softly. You asked that question as though I said something profound. You did. That seems unlikely. Victor smiled. You said that helping people is rarely convenient. Claire thought for a moment. Then she nodded. That sounds like something I would say. You also said that convenience is a terrible way to decide what matters. Ethan shook his head. That is actually a very good line. Claire laughed. I was 22. I probably thought I had all the answers. Maybe you had one of them. Victor's voice carried a quiet sincerity. Claire looked at him. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The harbor lights reflected in the glass around them. The city beyond continued moving as it always had. Cars crossed bridges. Ferries traveled across dark water. Office windows glowed against the skyline. Life continued. Yet for Claire, something fundamental had changed. Not because she received an award. Not because programs had expanded. Not because people finally recognized her work. Those things mattered, but they were not the reason. The real change was simpler. For years, she had viewed her life as a collection of unfinished plans. Goals delayed. Dreams postponed. Opportunities missed. She measured herself against what might have been. Somewhere along the way, she stopped noticing what already was. The families she had helped. The communities she had served. The relationships she had built. The lives quietly touched through ordinary acts repeated consistently over time. Tonight forced her to see those things differently. Victor glanced toward the award sitting alone on the table. You should take that with you. Claire looked over her shoulder. It seems too heavy. Ethan laughed. Metaphorically or physically? Both. Victor shook his head. Somehow that is the most Claire Bennett answer imaginable. They eventually made their way toward the exit. The conference hall had nearly emptied. Staff members stacked chairs and gathered materials. The evening was ending. Outside, a cool breeze drifted in from the harbor. Claire paused near the entrance and looked back one final time. A year earlier, she had entered a ballroom believing she did not belong there. She had assumed her role in life was to support from the background while others occupied center stage. What she discovered instead was something far more valuable. Importance was not determined by visibility. Influence was not measured by titles. And purpose did not require permission. Victor opened the door and stepped outside. Ethan followed. Claire lingered for one last second before joining them. Together they walked into the evening beneath a sky filled with distant city lights. There was no dramatic ending waiting for them. No final surprise. No grand declaration. Only the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing a life has been lived with intention. Years earlier, a young woman stopped to help a stranger because it felt like the right thing to do. She never expected anyone to remember. She never expected gratitude. She certainly never expected that single choice to echo across so many lives. But perhaps that was the point. The most meaningful things rarely begin with recognition. They begin with kindness. And as Claire disappeared into the Boston night beside two unlikely friends, she carried with her a truth that had taken years to fully understand. She never needed the world to see her value. The value had been there all along.